Welcome everybody, I'm Sara Nesteruk. I'm a senior lecturer in creative digital design here at SODA. So this event is the sixth in a series. The film we've just watched is the Babushkas of Chernobyl from 2015. This is the last event in the series, so I'm just going to do some very quick thank yous. First of all, thank you to FREnd who've funded the whole programme, and in particular to Esther Liss-Carew, who isn't here but was kind of really been fundamental to all of the organisation. So thank you to Esther. Also thank you to Louis Bauer, who's making the films, which will all be available on the festival website and on YouTube. And also thank you to Yatunde, who's been involved as the events assistant for the last 3 of the 6 screenings. I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Richard Taylor, who is from the University of Manchester, who's joining me for the final Q&A. Richard is BNFL Chair in Nuclear Energy Systems at the University of Manchester's Dalton Nuclear Institute. He was previously the Chief Engineer of the UK's National Nuclear Laboratory. Richard has over 30 years of experience within the UK nuclear industry. He is a professional engineer with a background in the design, construction and commissioning of nuclear facilities. Richard is co-founder of the Beam Nuclear and Social Research Network. Richard also is a graduate from MMU who graduated last month with an MA in creative writing from the Manchester Writing School. So a very warm welcome.
Thank you.
So my first question is, can you give an overview of your work, your specialisms and your interest?
I'll try, although I think you've just sort of done that, really. Yes, I'm a career nuclear engineer, I suppose you'd describe me as. I've worked, that said 30 years, but I might have to call it 40 years now, I'm afraid. So I worked for many years in the nuclear sector as a sort of jobbing professional engineer on quite a lot of nuclear plants, most of which are associated with nuclear waste management rather than reactors. Mostly but not exclusively in the UK, mostly but not exclusively at the Sellafield nuclear site in West Cumbria. So I did that for many years as a sort of coalface, sorry that's a sort of mixed metaphor, isn't it, as a nuclear face engineer working on design and commissioning big nuclear plants, and then latterly on research, particularly applied research associated with building nuclear plants and getting them to work. I joined the National Nuclear Laboratory. I was their chief engineer for about 8 years. When I left that job, I was approached to join academia by the director of Dalton Nuclear Institute, who said, "Do you want to join academia?" And I said, "No, I do not want to do that." And he said, "Well, there's an opportunity to make links with humanities and get some interdisciplinary research going in nuclear." And that was the thing that sort of tempted me to come across onto the academic side, which I did about 8 years ago. I've got a particular research interest in nuclear as social practice, and obviously the film we've just seen was all about that, and also in the likes of digital twinning and the disruptive effect of digital technologies and how they might disrupt the nuclear industry, I guess you might say. So that's my job. Of course, my passion is creative writing, which you alluded to, Sarah. So I've just completed a master's degree at the Manchester Writing School at MMU, which is a fabulous school. Just a little plug for MMU there. I graduated last month, and I'm working on the novel that I started as part of that process. And I've published a few things. I have a collection of short stories, so you can buy me on Amazon if you're looking for a stocking filler for Christmas. I have touched on some sort of engineering and science subjects in my creative work, but I haven't written about nuclear because that feels like a bit of a busman's holiday for me. So that's how I ended up here.
Oh, that's fascinating. Thank you. A really wide range of skills and interests.
Yeah, you could probably say so.
My next question is about the Beam, which I've just come across and just looks absolutely fascinating. So the Beam Research Group produces qualitative social research based on long-term comparative ethnographic study of nuclear waste management and decommissioning, and energy practices and politics. Can you talk more about the group, for example, your cross-disciplinary work and current projects?
Yeah, I can try. That's quite a broad subject, obviously, but I mean, I came to the Beam for a direction of working in the nuclear industry for a long time. So I had a recognition that the social sciences, the anthropological issues, the idea of nuclear projects as social projects was really important and particularly neglected by the industry itself. So I saw it as important work that was destined to be enlightening and insightful, particularly to the nuclear industry. And of course, I sit on the barrier, that's probably not the word, the edge, the cusp, the liminal space, if you prefer, between the industry and all the attitudes and the institutionalized behavior there, and academia in humanities, and dare I say, all the attitudes and institutional behavior there, and how to get these sides making sense to each other and sort of talking and understanding the same language. I always saw it as not providing answers to nuclear questions, but providing better questions and allowing people, particularly in the industry, giving them new ways to think about problems, new aspects, and of course things like social science, anthropology, ethnography particularly does that because it places people with different outlooks and different ways of looking things right in the face of the nuclear industry. So it's been quite challenging on both sides, particularly when you get into issues of allegiance with the nuclear industry, which of course is very important for the academic side to be independent of that. And also for a nuclear industry which has accepted norms, particularly about what it means to communicate nuclear practice and what is necessary to do that well, and to challenge those norms. So it's been challenging on both sides. It's also been challenging to get any money because it's quite difficult to really get some traction into interdisciplinary work because it tends to fall between stools of funding. And we're very grateful to the University of Manchester for some of the internal funding that they have managed to put into the Beam and allow us to undertake our research work. I think you asked me about what we actually did. Just to cover that very briefly, we've had long-term ethnographic projects going at Sellafield, particularly associated with how to, I'm going to use some air quotes here, live with the nuclear. So it's the idea about the publics that live around nuclear sites, how they're created, how controversies are created, because the nuclear industry thinks it works with the public. It doesn't think it's a part of that public, and it doesn't feel that it's created that public through what it's done. So there's quite a lot of insight involved with saying, look, this isn't you just coming in and dealing with what's here. This is you creating what's here and being part of what's here. So we've done quite a lot of ethnographic work there. A colleague of mine, Professor Petra Kelshoven, has been doing work on that. I've also had colleagues looking at robotics, nuclear robotics, and saying what are the barriers that prevent robotic take-up in the nuclear sector, and how complex is that? What are the cultural norms that might affect how and when that happens? We've done work at Hinkley Point C, which is the new, hopefully everyone's sort of seen that on the news. It's the big nuclear reactor, the big nuclear mega project that's out there. So we've done ethnographic work down there, looking about really a lot of the unintended consequence and the unseen consequence of bringing a mega project to a particular area and how that affects local communities. So I've had colleagues, Professor Penny Harvey of the School of Social Science at who has spent, you know, significant time, because I've learned that's what ethnography is like. It's a sort of calling, isn't it? It's a vocation that people go and live for years in these communities and immerse themselves in the practice. So we've had some work which I believe has revealed some insightful things about living with the nuclear down in Somerset. And I say that because I'm interested in the word insightful. If you work in a university, we talk all the time about impact. And I find that at my stage in the career, I'm not interested in it. It takes too long. But the thing about insight is you can have it straight away. So I think we've done work that has already delivered insight and has already encouraged people to think about things differently in nuclear space. And they've got that straight away and for very little investment, whereas to see the impact of that sort of takes a long time. So I take some comfort in that insights have already been provided. Obviously we're doing other stuff, but maybe we'll move on to that.
Yeah, thank you. And that idea about time is going to come up later as well. The references and relationship to time.
Okay.
So coming to the film itself,
yes.
The film shows a group of women who live in the Chernobyl exclusion zone. It was released in 2015, almost 30 years after the accident in 1986. Can you give an overview of the uses of nuclear power, the benefits and risks, and the legacy that this particular accident will leave behind, both now and for the future? It's just a little question, that, is it? Well, let's talk about nuclear power. Mm-hmm. Nuclear power has been around a long time and has been part of a lot of countries' energy mix for a long time. I suppose over the years it's sort of morphed in terms of what it promises. When it first came about, it was all about, you know, it's going to be cheap. It's going to be sustainable and cheap. It's going to be too cheap to meter nuclear energy. So it was all about, it's a new technology, it's a sustainable technology, and we're going to be able to do it cheaply. Latterly, it became about it's part of the green agenda, particularly in the last year or two, this language around net zero. So it's part of the contribution to solving the existential threat of our age, which of course is global warming. So it's become part of that. And even more latterly still, it's actually become about energy security, particularly after the war in Ukraine, and the fact that, you know, you would not necessarily want to be beholden to other nations for all your energy needs. And nuclear gets a big tick for energy security because it is sustainable, and the material you need for the fuel is relatively plentiful and available from more benign sources, shall we say. So in terms of what it's there for, that has changed. And of course it's waxed and waned as those issues have become more or less important to people. So currently you would say it's on an upturn. There's a lot of reactors being built. There's a lot of reactors being planned, particularly in the UK. There's been a lot of reaction to incidents like Chernobyl, which of course is a long time ago now, and latterly Fukushima, which is in 2000 and sort of just before this 2011.
Yeah, just before this film was made. So that's affected things. So it's been all of those things over all of those years, and it's waxed and waned with all that, with how those issues sort of play out globally and of course regionally as well. Just tell me what else was in your question.
My question, yeah, it was a big question. It's about the legacy of the accident. So
right, yeah, okay.
Both now and also for future generations, which was spoken about a lot in the film.
It was spoken about a lot, yeah, which I thought was one of the most interesting and in a way sort of uplifting. It's an affecting film, isn't it? It's an uplifting film as well, I thought. That, I mean, it's accepted by many that people are motivated only by love and fear. And it struck me that the Babushkas were affected by love, the love of their motherland, the need and desire to get back to that. And a lot of the scientists are affected by the fear of not understanding something and the need to sort of get their arm and wrestle it to the ground, you know. And I thought it was really interesting how the Babushkas had shown that how their attitude had triumphed under these circumstances, and they'd actually been co-opted into the science. What it is to me is an example of citizen science, which is, because particularly for lower levels of radiation, it's very difficult to know the long-term health effects, as was talked about in the film. And you've actually got a community of people who are living off this land and eating this, So they're actually being co-opted into the science, which I thought was really interesting. And the other thing was they weren't afraid. Yeah, I mean, it was said a number of times in the film, we are not afraid. We're afraid of starving. We're not afraid of radiation. So they don't understand it, but they're not afraid of it. And actually, that's a very unifying thing, I think. When you look at the scientists and the Babushkas, that to me was what they had in common. They didn't really understand what they were dealing with. And it was quite interesting how their attitudes and the way the Babushkas were able to celebrate that, celebrate the fact that they didn't understand and see it as a uniting force and something that was sort of, maybe to be embraced was too strong a word, but not to be feared. And of course that is in stark contrast with how the world reacted to Chernobyl, which is like, we need to stop doing all this nuclear stuff for many, many, many years. So it had a significant and profound effect on the nuclear aspirations of many, many countries. And I think, that in certain places still lasts. More so Fukushima, I suppose, because it's more contemporary. But yeah, the Chernobyl, Fukushima's told us that large-scale nuclear accidents can happen. And they can happen when you say they'll never happen again. They can sort of happen. So it's more a question of how attitudes and how politics comes to live with that understanding, which is sort of part of my interest in the beam. Because I think living with uncertainties and things like that is a really important thing to understand. So it has, and it continues to do so, but not necessarily in a completely negative way, I would say.
What you were saying about fear, I think that in itself was really insightful. One of the women spoke about it, about we're afraid of starvation. She said, I'm afraid of starvation, but I'm not afraid of radiation. And what she was alluding to there was in the 1930s in Ukraine, there was a huge collectivization program which resulted in probably about 4.5 million people died during that process, Holodomor. And so I think they're living on this land and it's bountiful and they were growing these amazing foods. And then she was there just saying, I'm not afraid of this. I don't want to die. And I can see that I can eat. Yeah.
And why would you be? Yeah.
So coming to the power plant itself, in what ways was and is the Chernobyl nuclear power plant typical in its design and construction? What and where are the main differences between this and other sites?
Well, that would require a nuclear reactor expert to answer with any detail, and I should put in a disclaimer in that I'm not necessarily that. The thing about the language that's used these days is a thing called passive safety. So the idea being that if you don't do anything to a nuclear reactor and you neglect it, it will revert to a passive and safe state. It won't revert to an unsafe state. So there have been a lot of improvements in terms of the passivity of nuclear reactors. So they become benign when you neglect them, you might say. There have been a lot of improvements in terms of the standard of containment. One of the problems with Chernobyl was that the standard of containment was not good, but it was typical of reactors that were built in that time. And of course, there's other reactors at the Chernobyl site that were back operating pretty quickly, and the other ones in Ukraine as well, because getting the electricity, losing the electricity was more of an existential threat than another incident like the one that was experienced at Chernobyl. So I would say reactors have improved both in time in terms of their risk of accident and their consequence of accident, but all those risks have by their very nature not been completely eliminated. And the nature of accidents is they tend to be unforeseen, don't they? For example, the Fukushima one, you know, the particular collection of circumstances that led to that were not foreseen, or if they were foreseen, they weren't acted upon. So who's to say that couldn't happen again?
Yeah, thank you. My next question you've spoken about in your first two answers.
Good.
I'll leave the question in. I think it may be insightful. What are the main benefits of nuclear power? What advantage does it have over other sources of energy production?
Yeah, I think I've sort of covered that a bit. The main advantage, I think, is that it is, depending on how you choose to measure it, fundamentally a green technology. So it doesn't sort of pump fossil fuels, carbon into the atmosphere. It doesn't do that. Obviously, there's some carbon associated with making the concrete to put it up. But in the longer term, it becomes carbon neutral, carbon beneficial. So that's a massive advantage. The other advantage is that you can have certain reactors that operate at very high temperatures, so you can do fancy stuff like desalination and making hydrogen and all that sort of thing. So it's quite versatile. It's also what they call base load, so it's there all the time. Unlike the sun and the wind, so it scores over intermittent sources of renewable energy, which is why it's often spoken about as part of an energy, I'm going to do it again, mix. So it has lots of advantages. You can recycle the fuel if you choose to. You can breed the fuel in certain reactors. So it has this, it has quite a lot of sustainability credentials that are not really generally exploited because a lot of people see them as too hard. But it does make nuclear waste, which was, as was alluded to the film, certain types of it last a long time. Certain other types of nuclear waste and types of radiation don't last half as long. So one has to come to terms with making that waste and the sort of intergenerational stewardship of that waste. Which is another reason I'm interested in the beam, because I think issues like intergenerational stewardship are talked about a lot and understood only a little what that actually means, and I think that's a subject worthy of unpacking.
It's one of my interests in the beam as well. So on the beam website there is a mini lecture series. In the first, your colleague writes about the relationship with time in nuclear decommissioning. So in quotes, geological time, history, the present, as well as near and deep futures. Yeah. So this is embedded in the narrative of the film. People towards the end of their lives reflect on history, and there is a discussion of the site, the Chernobyl site, in the near and distant future, the sarcophagus, for example. The timescales are so long in nuclear legacy. How does this appear in scientific and environmental planning? And do you see the film is effective in portraying this?
I think the film's very effective in portraying it. Yeah, because time is important. Time tends to make what we do look rather trivial, doesn't it? When you talk about geological time and when you talk about intergenerational legacy and you think about, well, the sarcophagus is going to be here 100 years, 200 years, it's got to last that, and how do we anticipate what the needs are, and how do we memorialise the site, and how do we recognise that it's there, and how do we warn people in the future about what they're encountering, and will that be necessary because they'll be a lot cleverer than us, and all this sort of thing. So I think the temporal aspects of nuclear are really important, because we're talking about you putting nuclear waste, for example, in geological in rock, so we're actually dealing with geological timescales there as well. So, but it's interesting to see for the Babushkas, where they're saying, well, time to me means eating and living my best life and living in a land that I love and seeing plentiful crops and drinking moonshine. And I love that one, goodbye brains, see you tomorrow.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
I can see myself using that at some point in the future. But and really that allowed the Babushkas to focus, and it sort of focused the argument in a way that I thought was particularly uplifting. I mean, you get into problems, I think, when you talk about, I like to talk about engineering timescales. So I would say as an engineer, maybe I can guarantee something for 200, 300 years, and I can reasonably confident scientifically I can do that. After that, all bets are off. So you then start talking about, well, what responsibilities, ethical and moral, do you have to timescales beyond that, and how can you even define what they are? How can you even sort of understand that as a problem? And that gets into issues like heritage, which we found was really important. What does nuclear actually mean to a local population? Is it does it feel like part of the heritage of the area? And how is that understood? And it also gets into issues like markers, how is a site memorialised, issues of public art. As part of what we did at the Beam at Sellafield, we actually commissioned some public art and an art exhibition which we exhibited in a local art space up in West Cumbria. And I just felt that was so important because it allowed people to think about their heritage and think about what the whole site meant to them in some other way than the facts and figures about nuclear. So, I can't even remember what the question was, but now we're talking about...
Well, the idea of memorialisation is really interesting. Actually.
Yeah, really interesting. Yeah, and particularly the issue of intergenerational responsibility, I think, because if you get too tied up on that, you start thinking about what can we do for someone in 300,000 years, when maybe if you were a babushka, you'd be thinking, what should I be doing today? And the answer is I should be crawling through that barbed wire and getting back to my home. So really the temporal issues are really, and we need anthropologists, social scientists to help an industry understand those issues that it's grappling with, because the industry has no expertise in understanding that. Although it likes to try, it's a very enthusiastic amateur when it comes to that sort of thing.
Well, maybe this is my next question. My next question is, what research is vital now for nuclear energy of the future, and how far ahead does this planning take place?
I think it's easily possible to say there's all sorts of research that's very important. An example that I would use, just to take it back to a specific, which sometimes helps with a question of that nature, is that we're looking at geological disposal of nuclear waste now. That is a real and present issue, and is very much tied into whether and in what way we get nuclear new build in this country, whether nuclear power is part of a future energy mix, whether it actually allows us to hit our net zero targets and save the planet. It's all tied up into that. And that project is the first project in the UK which works on the basis of volunteerism. So the people who are made responsible for delivering geological disposal of nuclear waste are engaging with communities, forming partnerships and saying, at some point, we'd like you to volunteer to be part of this process, looking into geological waste underground where you live. And at some point, we will decide together and in the meantime, we will incentivize you to become part of that process. And then at some point, we will decide together that we can place this waste here. And to me, that opens all manner of questions about who can decide that, representation, who can represent a community when a decision like that, the idea that you can have what's called I can never quite remember this phrase, a test of public support, which means that one day in the future we will ask the people in this area, are you happy to have a nuclear waste here? And if they say yes, that removes any chance to change your mind sometime in the future. So it's a sort of Rubicon moment for the whole process, which I think raises all sorts of questions about the validity of the process in the first place. And it's really important we understand all those issues around the process of socialising nuclear, if you like, and making these projects social projects and projects that are in partnership. And like, what does it, if you want a nuclear plant and you're in partnership with it, what does that mean to the individual? Does that give you accountabilities because you're a partner? It's not just happening to you anymore, you're sort of part of it. So I think, and that's relevant to things like small reactors. There's a lot of language about small modular reactors or even micro reactors, which might become ubiquitous. Like they might be in every town or whatever. You might have one next to your Tesco's. You're not looking too enthusiastic there. So, but, you know, you might want one, you know, it's a process I'd like call commoditization. You know, you take nuclear from something fancy behind barbed wire to something that exists everywhere. And what's necessary to do that? How does that affect attitudes? You know, do you become an advocate? Do you move there because they've got a microreactor? They've not got a Waitrose, but they've got a microreactor, you know, so we'll move there. And so there's all sorts of disruptive implications of doing things like that, which are not currently being researched or understood, which is another reason why the beam's so fabulous, basically.
That's fascinating. That's really insightful. Thank you so much. It brings up all kinds of
well,
other questions.
Well, you get insight straight away. We've agreed that.
Yeah, immediate.
Impact takes ages, but insight you can have now.
My next question is about the Chernobyl disaster. What was the effect of the Chernobyl disaster on the nuclear industry as a whole, both in terms of public perception and the way nuclear energy is produced and managed within the industry? Yeah,
that's an interesting, and I've actually got colleagues at Dalton who could answer that question a lot better than I can, which I should perhaps say. But, I mean, the whole history of how the nuclear industry has communicated with, and I'm going to do it again, the public, is very interesting. You know, that could keep us going all afternoon. But the approach that was always traditionally taken is something that was called decide, announce, defend, which is we're going to do this in nuclear space, we're going to announce it, and then when people say don't do that, we're going to defend it. So that was always the approach, and that was associated also with the idea that you need to educate people about nuclear. If I educated you, you'd end up feeling the same way that I do about it. For example, you're looking at me now thinking, no, I blooming wouldn't. And also that nuclear needs to be acceptable. I'm doing it again, acceptable. And of course, that's a pretty bland word, acceptable, isn't it? You know, it's not much of an ambition to say, I'm going to do this, and you've just got to accept it. You haven't got to embrace it. You haven't got to endorse it even, you've just got to accept it. So we have the language of education, we have the language of acceptance, and we decide, we don't consult, and we defend what we do. And actually, you could argue, and this is just a personal opinion, and there'll be other people with different opinions, that what Chernobyl did was entrench that attitude. It's now important to do more education, to try harder to make it acceptable, to decide harder decisions, to announce them, and then defend them with more ardour. You know, whereas you could say, you know, this is an illustration, there's things that neither side quite understand about nuclear, and that to err is human, and we've proven that. And actually what we're doing with nuclear new build is we're going on a journey together, the public and the industry, and the thing that brings us together in that journey is what we don't know, not what we do. And that's the reason why you would hold someone's hand and say, let's take this journey together. So I think for many years it's sort of reinforced that sort of rhetoric. So you tended to see middle-aged white men, for example, typically on the telly saying, don't worry about nuclear, it's all very safe indeed, and looking particularly shifty. And that was the whole tone of the whole thing for a long time, and really incidents like Chernobyl reinforce that. I would say, and I repeat, there are people who know much more about this than I do, that things are become more enlightened. There is much more consultation, there is much more acceptance of local knowledge and expertise and where that can come from. But nuclear is a very institutionalized thing. It's not something you can turn around straight away. So I would say, in terms of communication and in terms of understanding this thing about partnership and nuclear as social projects, the industry is very little along the way of that. And I don't think Chernobyl did anything to accelerate that. I think it would have stopped that happening for many years, regrettably. They should have asked the Babushkas, shouldn't they?
Yeah,
That's where they went wrong.
Have a different kind of knowledge, don't they?
They have a different kind of knowledge, yeah.
Actually, that's my next question. So the Beam has a strong focus on ethnography, questions, conversations, controversies, people and the environment. What can these women and their stories contribute to an overall and specific understanding of the event and its aftermath?
Yeah, I guess we've sort of covered quite a lot of that ground in what we've talked about already. I just thought they were fabulous. I mean, weren't they brilliant? And yeah, I think the things that struck me about it and the things that I thought were sort of profound lessons was the absence of fear. I thought that was massively important. The idea that, people decide what they should be scared, that's in their own hands. The fact that what they wanted was far more, what they loved and felt connected to was far more important to them. Because it's the whole idea of not everyone you would think would want to go back to someone they'd lived 60. It's not necessarily a concept that we would understand, but it's very powerful all the same, and it probably exists more than you think it does. At Sellafield, for example, in West Cumbria, it's quite an isolated community, so there's huge feelings of place. It's this issue of place, isn't it? And Chernobyl and Pripyat and all these places, there is this massive issue of place, this issue of motherland, and the mistake is thinking, oh, well, that's just Russia, it's just, you wouldn't get it. But place exists everywhere. We did some work at Wilfer on Anglesey, and in Wales particularly, there are industries that are seen as inherently Welsh. There's a Welsh word for it that I forget, which is sort of quite untranslatable, which means that it's just about being Welsh, like coal is Welsh, slate is Welsh, singing is Welsh, rugby is Welsh, nuclear is not necessarily Welsh. So whatever you do, how do you make something? Oh, just touched the mic. Sorry about that. How do you make it sort of intrinsic and part of the heritage of a place? And all these things are not well understood. But blimey, if you're going to do some research into nuclear power and the future it might have, let's look at these issues. The idea that you could do it without understanding those things, to me, seems absurd.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to ask two more questions.
Go ahead.
So my first of the two, there are suggestions in the film, both anecdotal and more scientific, that happiness and social structures can have an equal or greater influence on the health of a human being than nuclear radiation can. Is this claim scientifically valid?
I think it's almost a self-evident truth, isn't it, to me, that one's well-being, one's contentment, one's happiness is complex I think everyone you spoke to would say, yes, this is complex. My fear of radiation is part of what makes me happy and part of what doesn't. And maybe if I lived in Chernobyl, it'd be a bigger part than quite a lot of other people. Or if I was having a nuclear waste dump under my house, maybe it would be bigger. But other things are much bigger depending on time of life, depending on all sorts of factors. So if you wanted to prove that scientifically, you know, the number of confounding factors are enormous. So you wouldn't be able to prove it sort of for one individual or whatever. And the sort of scientific sample and all the factors that might influence your general feeling of well-being are legion. But I would say that the sort of film we've just seen is the best and simplest and most powerful and profound proof of that. You know, because they had people who moved to Kiev, didn't live as long. These people were demonstrably where they wanted to be. They weren't afraid. They seemed happy. You know, there was a lot to be jealous of them about, I felt. So I would say that if you wanted to try and validate it scientifically, that's your whole career gone right there. If you wanted to accept it as a universal and obvious truth, then I think that's quite easy.
There was a scene early on in the film where one of the ladies says, people come back from Kiev and they walk like this, and she showed people hunched, and then she said, and I walk like this.
Yeah, it was brilliant, wasn't it?
Showed herself tall.
It was like the breaking in the Olympics, wasn't it?
Yeah.
You know?
So that relates to what's going to be my final question. So there's an archetype in Ukraine of an indestructible granny. The Ukrainian babushka is a mythical hero, protector and nurturer, and women on average outlive men significantly in Ukraine. I was thinking actually when I put this together of the footage from 2022 that showed women almost with their bare hands standing in front of tanks with the Russian full-scale invasion. Does radiation affect women and men differently? To what extent do you think stereotype and belief allow the authorities to permit the people in the film to live where they do?
Physically, physiologically, I don't think it doesn't affect people particularly differently. You know, obviously there's certain issues like pregnancy, say, for example, and things like that might have some differences, but it might affect gender, might have some effect on how radiation is lived with and how it affects attitudes, and we probably saw all that. There's no men going back, is there? They're all, babushkas. I'm not quite sure what the male equivalent of that is. But yeah, so that's interesting, isn't it? And that's nothing to do with medicine, I don't think. It's to do with attitude and fortitude. And that's maybe a heritage thing, because the babushka in Ukraine is this person, so they're living that, you know, that heritage. So it's complicated, isn't it? But
there's almost no male equivalent, I don't think, in legendary terms. It's almost like this grandmother is so indestructible that they can live on this ground. And they can take it.
And maybe that partially explains their absence of fear.
Yeah, perhaps.
But I think living through Stalin probably explains that just as much as well.
Yeah, true. And they talk about the history and the things that they've lived through, and the Second World War, and then they're just sort of saying, well, this is nothing to us. We've lived through all of this terror, and we understand this a lot more. Yeah,
and what I would say about having worked in the nuclear industry a long time, it is very institutionalized. So you feel that your issues, particularly about nuclear waste, are the issues and more important than they actually are, you know, because you live in it. You live in that goldfish bowl all the time. You know, you have this safety is our number one priority mantra. You know, you couldn't say to a babushka, I'm moving you to Kiev because safety is our number one priority. You know, you can't do that, and you get consumed by that language, and I think it does mean that people lose perspective. So as part of the beam, that's one different way I would like the industry to think about things, you know, because you could ask the question, what if you said safety is not our number one priority? you know, and everyone in the industry would go, you know, but it isn't for the, you know, it just isn't. And it just allows you to think about the whole thing in a different way. It's not necessarily the answer, but that to me is a good example, you know, all the mantras, all the sort of props of this institutionalized existence, challenge them all and see what happens. And I think the beam and the work of Dalton will eventually help us to do that.
Well, I agree. I think the work that you're doing and the work you've described just sounds absolutely amazing. So I very much hope that it does have that impact in the long term, as well as the insights as well. So I'm going to open it up if there are any questions. Is there anybody else who would like to ask a question, please?
So in the movie, they were all eating the food and drinking the water and, you know, eating the produce from the animals. How does that not just kill them? Like, surely the water would be way too toxic for them.
Well, the thing is that the health effects, particularly of low-level radiation, is not as well understood as, you know, if you stood next to a nuclear fuel rod that had come out of a reactor, you'd know that that was bad for you and that was an acute problem. That would kill you quickly. Where you've got contamination that's been dispersed over a large area and it's hence been diluted and is moving about, and there's all sorts of natural radiation about, of course. If you live in Cornwall, you get a lot more radiation dose than you do if you live here, for example. If you take a lot of flights, you know, there's people getting low-level radiation doses all the time. So it's not really understood the long-term deleterious effects of taking slightly elevated doses of radiation. And particularly there's a difference between ingesting them. So it's a good point, Molly, because some things are very bad for you to ingest. Whereas, you know, some of the doses will go down. I mean, it's 35 years now. So things like iodine, which was talked about a lot, and a lot of thyroid cancers have been attributed to Chernobyl, that has a half-life of 8 days. So all that happens straight away and is not happening now. Whereas things like strontium and cesium that have 20, 30-year half-lives are still there in some quantity, but they're dispersed over a very, very big area. So the answer is it's low-level radiation dose. It's not well understood. There's lots of confounding factors. I think the lady in the film said that both sides can co-opt all the science to support their own argument. You know, and low-level radiation effects is one of those areas. So no, it's not going to kill you straight away. If I went there and someone offered, I'm not that keen on gherkins, but I would eat a gherkin and someone offered me a gherkin, I would eat it and not worry about it at all.
Oh, okay, that's really interesting to know, actually.
Not that that's probably going to happen, but yeah, so they won't die straight away for sure.
The official death toll after Chernobyl remains incredibly low. One of the earlier films we saw showed the people who were effectively bio-robots who were going onto the roof and clearing the radiation, all of whom just died in awful ways. That end of the science is understood. It's called prompt death, which is, so if you're on top of the reactor and you're shoveling nuclear fuel back into it, that's not a good place to be. But many people have survived the thyroid cancers, many people have got lower levels of radiation and have died from something, and then someone's got to work out whether their life has been shortened by that, and there are many different factors that influence that. And of course, whose official figures are they? You know, are they the IAEA or the Russian figures or anything? Yeah. But of course, this uncertainty, the nuclear industry would see that as something that's got to be solved. You know, they want to say, well, it's X deaths, it's Y deaths. Whereas we're actually saying, you know, low-level radiation has had some effect, but so is evacuating all these people. And the Babushkas of Ukraine are an example of, you know, how to live well under these circumstances. And, you know, there's a huge lesson in that for me. Okay, thank you so much. It was absolutely fascinating.
It's a pleasure.
Huge insight for me in all different kinds of ways, expected and unexpected as well. So thank you so much for your time and for talking about the film and your work.
Anytime.
And thank you for coming.